So the voter question in there, Mr. Ramaswamy, was cut off. Nothing was cut off. Let's talk about stepping up here. There's a moment that got some cable news attention, I think a couple of weeks ago, that was played, I believe obtained and played over on CNN, a moment from one of your campaign events. I want to play that.
You have to actually make sure the Federal Reserve is politically accountable. See, this idea that it's supposed to be some sort of special entity that exists outside the checks and balances of government, that's where the original sin begins. Right? And you're correct to point out what very few people are aware of. Absolutely, that happens. So the voter question in there, Mr. Ramaswamy, was cut off, but this was a question from a voter, from somebody at one of your events, asking about the Fed in what appears to be a conspiracy theory, putting zeros into the bank accounts of some of your political competitors. And that's you saying that this person is correct to point that out. It's one thing to suggest or to make the argument that the Fed needs more accountability, but that was the question. We have the transcript here. The question was about whether or not the Fed is adding zeros to bank accounts from media companies and to your political opponents. Why did you say that person is correct?
I didn't. I find it kind of laughable that you cut it that way. But what I have said is that the response that I stand by is that the Federal Reserve has been responsible for many of the economic headwinds that we've seen in this country. And I will dramatically reform the U.S. Fed by bringing an over 90% headcount reduction to the U.S. Federal Reserve. But with due respect, I'm going to tell you, you're doing your viewers and the media's doing a disservice if you're selectively cutting videos and then putting words into somebody else's mouth that wasn't in that video, when in fact what we should be doing is having an actual debate on the merits of Federal Reserve policy.
But that's what we're trying to do here, and it didn't sound like that's what you were doing in response.
And that's what we need.
Let me play
absolutely what I'm doing in response is I'm stating a policy that you disagree with, I'm not trying to have a debate with you about the opinion on the policy of the Fed. I'm simply asking you about your response to somebody who seemed to propose this conspiracy theory. Because do you agree that people running for presidency should be operating in the realm of fact? It's a pretty basic question. Of course they should, as I am. I'm tied to fact at every step. Frankly, I don't even recognize or understand what the alleged conspiracy that you're citing even is. That's the first time I'm hearing about some nonsensical theory that's actually putting words in somebody else's mouth who had legitimate concerns about the Fed and the financial system using central bank digital currencies through the Fed Now program that they're advancing that would give the government centralized authority to potentially wipe out bank accounts just like you see in China, just like Canada did to those truckers who were protesting in Canada. That's something that we do not want to see here in the United States. That's exactly what central bank digital currencies are about. That's what the Fed Now program is about. You have a Democratic candidate in this race in the form of RFK who's pointed out why that's wrong. I'm a Republican candidate pointing out the same thing, that the Fed needs to go back to one job: stabilize the U.S. dollar as a unit of measurement. Have their policies embracing inflation and unemployment as a balancing act been a disaster? Absolutely. And no, that's not a conspiracy theory. That is reality that has hurt many Americans, and we ought to have that debate in the open without distorting some people's questions, cutting them off on air, when in fact we get to the truth of the matter.
Nothing was cut off, and I appreciate you bringing this back to the merits of the issue at hand, which is about the Fed, as you did. So the voter question in there, Mr. Ramaswamy, was cut off. Nothing was cut off.
Nothing was cut off. Nothing was cut off.
That, of course, our conversation from the last hour. And so you can see it for transparency's sake, that clip we referenced on the Fed. Here it is from CNN.
The Fed is illegally taking money out the back door, not through the proper channels, or adding zeros to bank accounts to the media or their political, maybe your political opponents. How are you going to stop that illegal under the table spending of money from the Federal Reserve?
The answer is you have to actually make sure the Federal Reserve is politically accountable. See, this idea that it's supposed to be some sort of special entity that exists outside the checks and balances of government, that's where the original sin begins. Right? And you're correct to point out what very few people are aware of. Absolutely, that happens.